we live in a period characterized by a profound crisis about the evidence that forms the basis of medicine. Especially after the COVID-19 emergency, many scientific certainties are crumbling right now. So with his book, Medical Nihilism, Jacob Stegenga breaks into the dialogue on medical safety with arguments of deep philosophical basis. So, hello, welcome, hi.
Hello, thank you.
So let's dive right into it. So your book elicited two very distinct reactions. On one hand, very favorable reviews along with negative ones. Why is that so? What do you think about it?
Oh, an interesting question. I suppose the book did strike a nerve with some people. It did receive quite positive reviews in some journals. I've received a lot of emails from, say, physicians who read the book and had a lot of good things to say about it. Some of the more critical reviews came from my colleagues in philosophy. Philosophers are trained to be critical. It's part of what we're supposed to do. The thesis of the book can be seen as a kind of bold or radical thesis. And so when one is making such a thesis, especially about such an important institution like medicine, then there's bound to be people who both support the view and are critical of the view. And it's a complex project. So there's all sorts of ways in which people can look for things that they appreciate and look for things that they don't like.
Yeah, well, it's also a very ambitious project. So congrats. Basically, if we consider factors such as the poor theoretical basis of many interventions and the extent of misleading evidence in medical research, then our confidence is pretty low. It is not something easy to digest. So what can we do about that?
Okay, yeah. So let me start just by briefly kind of reiterating the main argument as you got started there. So, right. So there's sort of three pillars to the big argument of the book. One is as you said, the poor theoretical basis for many medical interventions. So we use some pharmaceutical, but there are very little theoretical reasons why we ought to expect such a pharmaceutical to work on such and such disease. So that's one kind of pillar. The other pillar is when we test interventions using the very best methods, so like the very best of randomized trials and meta-analyses, it turns out that for really widespread, widely used medicines, the effects are extremely small when they're tested in these best trials. And then the third pillar of the argument is that most medical research is what I call malleable. So it can be bent in various ways. And that bending tends to be towards overestimating the effectiveness of interventions, underestimating their harms, and away from truth. So those are the three kinds of pillars. And your question, what can we do about it? And I suppose one natural response is to address those pillars. So at the end of the book, the final chapter, I introduce what I call gentle medicine. There are different aspects to gentle medicine. It's basically a response to this skeptical worry in the book. So one aspect of gentle medicine is to improve our research methods, to make them less malleable. Another is to study interventions that we have better reasons to think will be effective. So for example, lifestyle interventions like diet or exercise. Another thing that we can do is try to mitigate the problematic impact of corrupting financial incentives in medical research. So there's all sorts of different things that we can do. And so part of the task of the book, sort of chapter by chapter, is to lay out a bunch of the problems, but then also address some of the possible solutions.
Okay, so you anticipated a question, actually, because I wanted to talk about the economic issue. Of course, that's a problem because there are a lot of financial incentives to sell, of course, medical interventions that seem effective. And, it's not really easy to gather more information as possible in order to be prepared to what they are trying to sell us. So I assume maybe that your book, is it possible to consider it as a tool to prevent that, as a shield, maybe?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I certainly hope that it can be used as a tool by different kinds of people. So one thing that I've been especially glad about is some policymakers have read the book and have been inspired to use some of the arguments from the book to alleviate some of the problems. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, we have this House of Lords Committee on Science and Technology, and so some of those policymakers and their staff have, spoken to me about the book and asked, what can we do to improve medicine? And then you were alluding to the idea that patients too might be able to use this as a tool. So, given the internet, patients now can be really well informed in the sense of getting a lot of information. They can go on Wikipedia or all these medical websites, but that information can be hard to process, hard to distill. And I think it's just not the case that we can read off the truth about medicine from the empirical literature directly. So we need some tools to interpret what we find on the internet, for example. And so my hope is that this book can be such a tool, for the average patient.
Sure. Also because I think it's very accessible to everyone, right? I mean, every kind of readers can, seek benefit from your book.
I'm glad to hear you say that. I mean, when I wrote the book, I was writing it primarily for an academic audience, although towards the end of the writing, I worked hard to try to make it accessible. I certainly don't shy away from the kind of technical side of things.
No,
but
you didn't. I can tell.
Right, yeah. But I did try to, put those technical bits in like an appendix or footnote, and the main body of the text I hope is accessible for your average reader.
Yeah, of course. So let's talk about a little bit about the introduction, because you talk about contextualized demarcation. I had some difficulties. Can you please explain it to me a little bit? Maybe in an easier way.
Yep.
A common.
Sure, no problem. Yep, no problem. Yeah. So a long-standing goal of philosophy of science has been the so-called demarcation problem. The idea is some human endeavors that have the look and feel of science aren't truly scientific. So a classic example is, say, Freudian psychoanalysis or astrology. They're making claims about the world, but the worry is that they're not truly scientific. And so there's been this goal for philosophers of science to come up with a principle that distinguishes the truly good scientific work over here from this sort of pseudoscience or sort of fake science over here. The problem has been that it's been really hard to come up with such a principle. So philosophers have tried for many decades, and they just haven't been able to come up with a principle that successfully demarcates the good science from the bad science in a context-free manner, in a kind of general manner. And so one possible response to that is to just throw up your hands and say, well, there's nothing we can do, and then we can't distinguish good science from bad science. And I think that that's a mistake. I think that philosophers of science should still be trying to demarcate good science from bad science, but in a contextualized way, in a kind of local way. So to take a particular domain, like medicine, and articulate very local, specific principles that can demarcate reliable, trustworthy science from unreliable science.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So in the third chapter, you write about something that it's really important, because you talk about the overtreatment phenomenon, which is, the joint opinion that we undergo more medical interventions than we should. So, of course, we can link this bad habit of us to fear, I think. Fear drives us to rely on, an external element rather than face the harsh truth, which is that the control over our Earth is frighteningly uncertain. So how can we unlock this fear?
Oh, that's a very important question. I'm not sure I have very much insight into how I would go about answering that question. I might just sort of reiterate the question. So I think you're basically right that that there's this big, I mean, it's part of human nature to feel this fear when one is ill and hope for some kind of intervention to improve our health. So that's a very fundamental aspect of human nature. And I think that generates this demand for medicine, this motivation to consume medicine as much as possible. Physicians themselves have long recognized this, and some of the most wise physicians in the long history of medicine have said, part of our job as doctors is to talk patients out of that demand to consume medicine, that hope for intervention. So I think very good physicians have always known this, that there's this part of human nature to hope for some intervention, and the job of a good physician is, when appropriate, to try to be as realistic as possible with patients about the prospects of improvement based on some intervention. And so, yeah, that doesn't do much to answer your question. It's a very deep one.
Yeah, it was a difficult one. Okay, so in conclusion, do you think there is actually a method, to make medicine more reliable in some way?
Yes, definitely. So one of my main goals of this book was to not just, articulate a bunch of problems with medicine, but also suggest ways in which medicine can be better. So I do this kind of chapter by chapter. So some of the problems that I articulate are very fine-grained features of sort of boutique aspects of medicine, like, these methods like meta-analysis, for example. But then there are these sort of more general things that can be done to improve medicine. And that's what I get at in the final chapter of the book, the 12th chapter on gentle medicine. So I've already mentioned a few of these. I think that we could be reshifting our research priorities away from a focus. We have this heavy focus on pharmaceuticals, and we should be reshifting our focus away from pharmaceuticals and more towards like public health interventions, lifestyle interventions, like diet and exercise. And so that's one big thing that we could do. In the clinic, physicians should be less interventionist. And that itself raises some interesting research questions. So a very naive response to my book would be to say, okay, patients should be coming off a bunch of their pharmaceuticals that they're already on. The problem with that is we don't actually have so much information about what it's like to withdraw from pharmaceutical treatment. We have a mountain of evidence for what it's like to be given a drug. That's the whole point of medical research, randomized trials and so on. Yeah. Now we have a small handful of studies that systematically and carefully test the effects of withdrawing from pharmaceuticals. Those studies have been very interesting. They show that patients can come off some pharmaceuticals carefully according to guidelines and have very good outcomes. So we need much more of that kind of research. We need careful studies of drug discontinuation programs. I mean, I could just go on and on. There are all sorts of ways in which medicine could be improved.
Okay. So are you referring to the, placebo effect, maybe, with this, discourse that you were doing?
So I do discuss at various places in the book the importance of the placebo effect, and that's also a focus of some of my current research following the book. So we know we have very good empirical reasons that tell us that for some diseases, they're very placebo responsive. So for example, depression is very placebo responsive. Other diseases aren't very placebo responsive, like stage 4 breast cancer.
No.
And so we should be doing what we can to learn about placebo effects in medicine and somehow harness the power of placebo when appropriate. So that could be part of this overall view that I'm calling gentle medicine.
Yeah, of course, always according to the guidelines, as you said before, you know, in a gentle way, withdraw the patient.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I would just add one caveat there. So some guidelines, I mean, medical guidelines are already, they're inheriting many of the problems that I articulate in the book. So
okay.
I wouldn't want to suggest that guidelines themselves are the kind of gold standard
No, they're
that
not,
clinical
of
practice should
course.
be held to. Yeah, so certainly guidelines themselves should be the target for revision based on many of the ideas in the book. It's just that if we go about changing clinical practice, I think that those changes should be cautious and conservative, just because we don't know what it's like to be branching out into this gentle medicine territory as much as we should.
Of course. The fear of the unknown. That's a problem old like the world, we say here in Italy. Okay,
Yes.
so thank you.